all for coming this afternoon. We have a very unique privilege of welcoming Noah Alper, the founder of Noah's Bagels, to speak with us today, this afternoon. Noah has 38 years of experience, and he's a 6-time entrepreneur. He works now, he has 38 years of experience doing business management and nonprofit management, and has recently come out with a book called Business Mensch, which he will tell us more about. So please join me in welcoming Noah.
Thank you, Charo. I'd also like to thank Ellen Spurtis for bringing me onto the Google campus today. It's a pleasure to be here. Just the food offerings alone is probably the only reason I was chosen as a food guy. It's amazing. But what I'm also reminded of is going backwards 50 years to when America was involved in a lockdown struggle with the Soviet Union over the putting a man onto the moon. And what's reminded me of it, and I was just speaking with someone a couple of weeks ago about this, was that if you would go into a NASA facility at that point, and you would have talked to the janitor, what would he have been saying my job is? He wouldn't have been saying my job is to clean the floors and to mop them spick and span. What he would say is, I'm here to put a man on the moon. And walking around the Google campus and talking to people today, in the brief time I've been here, I get that same kind of feeling that this place is all about your mission statement of disseminating and organizing information for the world. And by all accounts, you're doing a heck of a great job at it. I hope that in 50 years, and this is something that I was again thinking about just today, watching Toyota, everybody's read the papers, fantastic company, built on quality, only to get arrogant and to forget where they first started and are running into some real bumps in the road right now. I don't think that's going to happen here as long as this fantastic culture that's been developed perpetuates. So I wanted to say that before I go into a little discussion about my life and my book. As Charo said, my name is Noah Alper, and I would have to admit that I've been a serial entrepreneur for over 35 years. I've built 6 enterprises, 4 of which were successful. So I felt that with a 666 batting average, I had the credibility and the credentials to write my book, Business Mensch, Timeless Wisdom for Today's Entrepreneur. The book is not only about the bottom line, but it's also about the soul and the connection between the two. In these hard times, I've had occasion to fly all across the country and in many cases deliver messages to groups that are trying to get people jobs in networking and in inspirational meetings. And I'm reminded of one huge billboard that I saw driving in from JFK Airport into Manhattan, and it said in New Yorkese, Recession 101, self-worth beats net worth. And hopefully that kind of perspective, that kind of attitude is what's going to pull us out of this mess. And you folks here are going to be in the leadership role in doing that. In 1996, after only 6.5 years, my company, Noah's Bagels, the largest kosher retailer in the United States, with 38 stores from Seattle to Los Angeles, sold for $100 million. But 27 years previous to that, I was locked up in a psychiatric hospital for 9 months. It was 1969. I was a college senior at the University of Wisconsin. The Vietnam War was raging, and Madison, Wisconsin was one of the epicenters of the anti-war movement. I was uncertain about my future, and I was afraid of being drafted into a war that I did not believe in. These factors, combined with a lot of old personal issues and a steady diet of marijuana, sent me barreling over the edge. I was paranoid, I was delusional, and only after my parents took me home did the process of healing slowly begin. Very, very slowly, I regained my balance, and after getting out of the hospital, I was finally able to hold down a menial job in my brother-in-law's book warehouse, shelving books and filling orders. Eventually, and again very slowly, I felt the confidence and strength to handle a little bit more challenging job, which was a retail cashiering position in his Harvard Square store. So one night during this period, while living in Cambridge, I fell in love, and it wasn't a typical kind of romantic love we're used to. It was actually the love of a salad bowl. Now, these were rustic wooden salad bowls that my grandmother probably would have chopped gefilte fish in or liver in. Very, very rustic bowls. But at that time in the early 70s, rustic and natural was in, and plastics were definitely out. When these bowls were rubbed with vegetable oil, they glowed. And they just got me so excited that the next day, I got into my VW bus, because in 1971 you had to have a VW bus. Went up to Vermont and picked up $1,000 worth of these salad bowls, only to start off back into a blinding blizzard, and the VW bus went off the road into a guardrail. I had these $1,000 of salad bowls. I didn't know how to get them back to Cambridge, where I was going to be hawking them. So I rented the biggest Lincoln made, and I stuffed the bowls in the trunk and in the glove compartment and under the seat, got them back to Cambridge, took out my Indian bedspread, because that was kind of standard issue as well. It kind of went along with the VW bus. Spread it out over the back of the rented Lincoln, put the $1,000 worth of salad bowls on display on the back of the trunk of the car, and in an hour and a half they were all gone. Thus, my first business, the Alper Wooden Bowl Company, was born. Beyond selling them off the back of the car, my brother-in-law taught me an early lesson in being a mensch. And just to refresh those of you that might not be familiar with the term, mensch is originally a German word meaning man. The Yiddish word is the same pronunciation, but it means a man, a person, what he, they, she should be in an ideal world. In God's world, that's what a man should be, is a mensch. So my brother-in-law taught me about being a mensch when I was out in front selling these salad bowls, because he charged me the princely rent of $150 a month. But he didn't take the money. He wanted me to donate it to the charity of his choice. And I got a really a first-hand view of what it's like to run a company from an ethical standpoint and from a standpoint of involving others as well. So I'm selling the bowls on the sidewalk. I'm also going to gift stores, gourmet stores in the greater Boston area and selling these salad bowls. And at the same time, my former wife and I decided to open up a natural food store in Brookline, Mass, called Bread and Circus. Now, this was right in the heart of the brisket belt, okay? Kosher butchers, one after the other, delis. Schmaltz, or chicken fat, was a staple item in most neighborhood refrigerators, but nobody there knew what organic carrots were in 1973. There were only a handful of such stores nationally. And if there's one thing I think that I've been able to do successfully in my business career, is to spot an emerging trend and to try to get, if you use the wave analogy, to try to get there just before that wave is crashing, but not early enough that nobody knows what the heck you're doing. This was a borderline. It took about 2-3 years until this store was really something that the local neighborhood understood. When we first opened, people said, is this a hardware store? They didn't understand the wood walls, the sort of rustic look that was popular among certain circles. There were really no such thing as natural food stores. There were health food stores. There were stores that sold Tiger bars and vitamins and distilled water. But a store that would be, part of a whole lifestyle movement was something that was really in its incipiency at that time. Brands like Tom's of Maine, Celestial Seasonings, Haagen-Dazs, these are all brands that we brought in that were brand new and no one had ever heard of them. And we could not have imagined that these would have been mainstream items that you would have seen at a Safeway or a Lucky's in those days. This was, as I mentioned, a part of a lifestyle movement that grew and grew and grew. However, for us, being in that retail environment was very difficult. I'm kind of a guy who has what they refer to in Yiddish as spilkies, okay? And spilkies is kind of terminal ants in the pants. And for me to sort of sit, day to day, week after week in this one retail location was not really something that I wanted to continue with. So 3 years after opening the store, we sold the business to a young Irish immigrant by the name of Anthony Harnett. Now, I knew that this enterprise at that time, because 3 years had passed, was on the move. And I knew that it was going to be something that was going to develop and grow. And indeed it did. Bread and Circus became the largest natural food store in the Northeast. And in 1996, it was sold to Whole Foods Market. Simultaneously to the development of Bread and Circus, I continued to work with a woodenware. I built that business up and eventually was importing from 8 countries and selling to over 2,000 natural food stores and cookware stores and catalog houses and department stores across the country. This was part of yet another emerging trend, which was the gourmet industry. And you only have to go downstairs to see your lunch offerings to understand that. In those days, I mean, we're talking, Salisbury steak, Swanson TV dinners, canned vegetables. This was the haute cuisine of the day. But people had started to go to Europe, young people in particular. Airfares had come down. People had experienced continental cuisine, and they wanted to replicate it in their kitchens, and they needed serving utensils and implements and tableware to reflect that interest in fine dining. Julia Child was emerging as a very popular figure on television, and all of these factors combined to create a brand new industry called the gourmet industry. And the first ever gourmet show was actually held just up the line here a little bit in San Francisco. As the company developed from these rustic wooden bowls into this import business of artisan-made housewares, the name changed. Never being accused of being overly humble, it was a very logical and easy transition to change the name from the Alper Wooden Bowl Company to the Alper International Incorporated Company, which it became in the late 70s and early 80s. I ran Alper International until 1984, and after selling it to a colleague, I took a much-desired year off. And this year off coincided with a planned move to the West Coast. As a prelude to that year, and on a whim, I decided to go to Israel. I had never been there before, and I was curious to see what it was all about. I immediately fell in love with the land, with the people, with the spirit, and I came back dedicated to trying to strengthen the Israeli economy by connecting my next business to the Jewish state. Ronald Reagan was in power, and I heard a statistic that 1 out of 3 Americans had admitted to a born-again Christian conversion. So my concept was, why wouldn't these same people be interested in buying things from the land of Israel, from the land where Jesus walked? Special gifts from a special place was the slogan for the company. Evidently, the gifts weren't that special because that business was a total and complete failure. I didn't really know my customers in retrospect. I should have really partnered with a Pat Boone or some other kind of Christian minister and been sort of the expediter, the middleman, the backdoor guy who sourced the products. But I didn't understand that at the time, and this failure was very difficult for me. But as I explain in a chapter in the book called Come Back Stronger, I'm convinced that I would not have been as successful in my next business had I not gone through that experience. And in the way of an example, Our first store at college at Alcatraz in Berkeley was a very, very successful store right off the gate. The landlord told me 1 year after we opened, when the store was going gangbusters, that she said, you know, Noah, based on your resume of the Holy Land Gift Company and some of these other things, I'm not sure I would have rented you this space in this high traffic location, seeing that you had had such a miserable failure, and you were sort of, looking for a job when I rented you the store. She said, but you had such a fire in your belly, she said, that I was convinced that no matter what you went into, you were going to be a fantastic success. And on that basis, I rented you that store. So, backtracking a bit, I'm licking my wounds, and I'm facing the sobering fact that I had a family to provide for, and I needed either a job or a new business venture. Just at that time, my brother Dan had been to Montreal and had taken a video, which was pretty radical in those days to begin with. Camera was about this big. Showed me this video of this sort of Willy Wonka of bagel shops in Montreal, where you would see the bagels going through these glass tunnels and coming out on the other end, and it was an amazing show. And he looked at me and he said, you ought to do this in Berkeley. At which point I looked at him and I said, if this is such a great idea, Dan, why don't you do it in Berkeley? He said, no, you're the entrepreneur, you're the one that's supposed to do this. I said, okay, it's kind of interesting. I don't know about 4 o'clock in the morning. I got a 4 in my mechanical aptitude test out of 100. I'm not sure I'm going to be the one to fix the ovens in the middle of the night. But you know what? I'll go back east and I'll check it out. I remembered, as I mentioned, that during the Alper International days, as part of my research, this came to me that this gourmet show, San Francisco, the home of every kind of fantastic ethnic cuisines of all descriptions, with one major exception. There weren't any really fabulous bagels. So after prowling around the bowels of old New York and the lowest of the Lower East Side and thinking a lot about this, talking to my wife, who was a Brooklyn native and would always tell me whether I was on track, off track, in terms of my concepts, decided after the end of the year that this was a go. I had the makings of a winning formula. I had a great concept. I would combine a terrific bagel with what was called in New York appetizing stores. And what these appetizing stores are is a place where you could get great herring and cream sauce and all cream cheese spreads. It was a dairy deli. In Jewish tradition, meat and milk are kept separate. So this would have been a collection of great dairy items. Pickles and cakes and smoked fish and things like that. So that was the concept. And from the moment that first store opened, 1 mile from the UC campus, it was an enormous success. I had never intended to found a large company. It was all about one store and making it great. And I am convinced that perspective of making that one store great is what really kept that business successful as we went through. I can remember my brother Dan at one point calling me and said, we were written up in the San Francisco Chronicle as being a chain. Very upset. I said, Dan, we have 9 stores. We are a chain. Well, I know, but, I just don't like it. And I think that his comment was emblematic of how we ran the business. It wasn't a chain. It was a collection of local stores. And again, coming back to your enterprise here, I hope as you get larger and larger and larger, and instead of taking over a quarter of the world, you may be able to take over a half of the world, that you keep this perspective that there's always someone at your back, and no matter how big you get. And it's always important to retain that humility. I think in my case, I was just kind of born hungry. So no matter how successful that store was, I was always looking over my back and seeing who was about to overtake us. That's the way I did business, and that's the way the company did business as well. I've discussed some of the steps towards a winning business concept, but I discuss many other tools in the book. In particular, our approach to our customers, our communities, and our employees. And as an example of how we took care of all of these constituencies in a very substantive way, before we would open up any of our stores as we were expanding, we would do a community service project. We would go out into the community. In one case, in Los Angeles, we painted an entire house in a rough section of LA in a day. We had 30, 35 crew members, including part-timers, and we would go down there to the various locations, and whatever the communities involved were interested in, we would pitch in and do a service project. What these service projects did were not only telling the community, we're here to stay, you're very important to us, but it helped to bind the crew together. By working on the service projects together, they got to know one another. Before we opened a store, everybody knew everybody's name and knew a little bit about them. And they felt good about the company that they worked for, so that they were able to deliver the kind of service that allowed Noah's to have 1/2 the turnover rate of an average quick service retailer company. And all of you know that translates into huge advantages in terms of morale, in terms of cost savings, and in terms of overall performance in the business. In 1995, we're expanding very fast. Excuse me. And looking for a strategic partner. We had been co-locating with Starbucks often, as it was a very symbiotic relationship. Bagels, coffee. Our real estate people kept seeing each other at various locations that were opening up. We eventually formalized that partnership, and Starbucks became a 25% owner in Noah's. 1 year later, we get a serious threat. And the threat is from the Einstein Bagel Company out of Golden, Colorado. It was a public company, and it was acquiring regional bagel chains across the country. And they gave us basically two options. And the first option was sell us the business, and the second option was look for an Einstein Brothers Bagel Company. I told you I got a 4 on my mechanical aptitude test, didn't I? I was even able to stand here and do nothing and break the microphone. I mean, I think, you know. So, there comes Einstein Brothers. They're threatening to either acquire us or compete with us in every location across the West Coast. We thought a lot about it. We didn't like the offer. It wasn't enough money. And it was also a stock deal, and it wasn't all cash. By then, needless to say, it was not also just about me. We had venture capital partner, we had Starbucks, we had senior management, and by the way, Brother Dan, he came into the business a year after we opened the first location. We had store managers, we had assistant managers, we had a lot of constituencies, but as a collective, we decided that offer wasn't substantial enough for us to sell the business. A year later, they came back with a new and improved offer, which was an all-cash offer. As I mentioned, or was mentioned in the introduction, it was indeed for $100 million. And we took the offer, thus avoiding a bloody bagel shootout in the Wild West. Hopefully, you'll read the book, and I understand they're on sale for $5, and as they used to say in the Lower East Side, such a deal. How could you pass up $5? You'll learn that I'm a firm believer in working hard. I'm also a firm believer, and I think this has been really institutionalized in this culture, and I don't even know if I have to say this to you, but in balance and in maintaining perspective. I'm still not sure how you guys unleash yourselves from all of your hardware, but I'm also a firm believer that that's important, that taking a time off, whether it's, in my case, I'm Sabbath observant. I don't work on Saturday. I shut the phones. It's like what everyone pays thousands of dollars for. To go to a desert island and turn off the phones and not be bothered by anyone and do exactly what they want. I do that every week. Not that all of you need to do that, but the idea of maintaining perspective and balance in our lives has never been more important. And I'm fond in my speeches of talking about how, you know, what are the engineers going to throw at us next to make us even more leashed and connected and wired, but I realize I'm talking to them right here. So not that you guys shouldn't invent them, but very, very important to take a walk around the park, to go in the endless lap pool, and I can see that you're doing that already. I wish that the entire country could really understand the importance of that balance and how, indeed, it improves our work performance as well as it helps to ensure our personal health and the health and the unity of our family structure. So after selling Noah's Bagels, I had a dream, and my personal dream was to spend a year in Jerusalem with my family. Unfortunately, our oldest son was not able to join us for the year as he was in college, but the younger two boys and my wife and I did indeed spend a year in Jerusalem. I was at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. I learned what I never learned in school about my own tradition. Most or many Jewish people have about a 6th grade education in their own traditions, and that wasn't much different than mine. I was able to get the equivalent of a higher education in Jewish thought, and it was an absolutely a tremendous year for me personally. My boys were in Israeli public school. My wife was doing some really interesting volunteer work. After the end of the year, I came back to San Francisco, and almost immediately upon touchdown at the airport, was approached to help found a Jewish community high school in San Francisco. So on September 1st of 2001, 10 days before 9/11, we created the Jewish Community High School of the Bay. It was an interesting first month of operations. After a year, the school moved to San Francisco, and I'm proud to say that the school now has 180 students. My older son started the organic lunch program, which was and remains to be a model for school lunch programs across the United States. It's very similar to going to a Google cafeteria. Tremendous food, handcrafted, and tremendously healthy. After 4 years of full-time volunteer work for the high school, I again began to have an itch to get back into the food business. If any of you have had familiarity with it, it's something that you can't shed very easily. So my wife and I opened a kosher Italian vegetarian restaurant in downtown Berkeley called Ristorante Raphael in 2003. Unfortunately, 4 years later, the bottom line results weren't there, and the lease was coming due, and we had to call it a day. But we had tons of adoring patrons and great memories. In the beginning of 2008, in response to many requests, I started my own business consulting practice to help small businesses with concept creation, marketing, and executive planning. And if any of you, go off to do your own thing after leaving Google, I'm the guy to call. Later on that year, I decided to codify or to compile a business memoir, both the successes, the failures on a personal level, on a business level, lessons I had learned, a lot of stories from my father, who was the consummate business mensch, and this was 38 years of really just coming into industries and seeing them born and grow up and mature, and a lot of stuff you learn in 38 years. So I finished the book, Business Mensch, Timeless Wisdom for Today's Entrepreneur. It went out for sale in September. And while envisioning this book, Jewish thought informed my direction. We are, by some recounts, 5,000-year-old tradition. We have a lot of wisdom, a lot of accumulated perspectives to share with the world. And so the book is framed through the lens of Jewish values and Jewish wisdom and Jewish pride. But I also wanted to make it clear that, like there was an old Levy's rye bread ad years ago, and it said you don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's. Well, it's the same with my book. You don't have to be Jewish to read the Business Mensch. And in the book, I talk about being a mensch, or being a highly principled person, and being successful in business. dispelling the notion that most or all Jewish business people are like Bernard Madoff, who I refer to as the anti-Mensch. And in the book, I share wisdom not learned from business schools, because I didn't attend one, nor from MBA computer models, which I really can't understand, but more from Jewish sources, and more importantly, from my own trial and error on what I like to call the real streets of life. So, by way of a little bit of preview, I'm going to read a couple of short pieces from the book, and I think that these will give you a little bit of a flavor as to what's inside. So this is from a chapter called Have a Little Chutzpah. And I think since it's written in the New York Times without any kind of translation, probably everybody knows what that means. And if they don't, there's a company called Google. You just go in under chutzpah. I think they'll be able to tell you what it is. My own earliest lesson in chutzpah came when I was 10 years old. The teacher, my cousin Donnie, 3 years my senior. Growing up in suburban Boston, we were both hockey fanatics and seized on any opportunity to skate, usually on a nearby field that was flooded over and frozen in the winter. Then we heard about a new country club where a winter ice rink had been created on the tennis courts, complete with genuine hockey nets and sideboards. Donnie and I couldn't wait to try it out. So one Wednesday evening, Donnie gathered a group of our friends to go to the Sydney Hills Country Club for a hockey game. There was just one problem. None of us were members. Now that didn't bother Donnie. He led the way, and a dozen of us, all carrying sticks and skates, followed, proceeding to the rink, lacing up, and starting a game of hockey. We were enjoying the smooth ice, the warm glow of the floodlights, and the thrill of sending the puck into a real net when another group of kids showed up looking to use the ice. Donnie looked them up and down. "You guys members here?" he asked. "Of course," they said in chorus. Donnie shook his head slowly. "Sorry," he said, "Wednesday is non-member night." They looked at him confused. "Come back another night," he said. The kids didn't protest. Politely and respectfully, they gathered up their gear, found a payphone, and called their parents, and then disappeared into the night. Donnie flashed a huge grin, and the rest of us played on, savoring the rink until the club shut off the lights late that night. Now that was chutzpah. Lastly, from the chapter, The Power of a Mensch. In the 1950s, long before the government enacted laws to protect employees and prohibit workplace discrimination, my father, a food broker in New England, founded the Massachusetts Commission on Fair Employment Practices. Its name made it sound like a bona fide government agency, but it wasn't. Dad and a friend took it upon themselves to speak out for workers. They would investigate reports of discrimination and write press releases to bring attention to the issue. They were bloggers before their time. Dad always taught me that people are capable of tremendous things. An employer's role is to give them a chance, supply them with the tools they need, and help them to reach their potential. I saw the benefits of treating your employees right firsthand and developed what I call the 14-piece bucket rule. That term came from the college summer I spent traveling around the country working odd jobs. In Denver, where I worked as a delivery boy for a chicken place, the owner had a policy of not giving the employees any free food. I spent long hours inhaling the aroma of freshly fried chicken. My mouth was watering. I'm only human after all, but I knew the policy. It just felt unfair to me. It felt cruel and inhumane to put a 20-year-old kid around food all day and tell him he can't eat. So after a while, let's just say the 16-piece chicken buckets started becoming 14-piece chicken buckets. Later, when I ran Noah's, I made sure that our policy allowed employees to eat as much food as they wanted. To me, that simply seems like good sense. Instead of tempting my employees into sneaking a bit, I invited them to feel like a part of the enterprise. The heart of my message in Business Mensch is this: doing the right thing not only makes us all feel good, but it's good for business. Thank you very much, Google. It was a pleasure to be here today. I'd be happy to take some questions if there are any. Yes, sir.
I have a couple of questions. Did you ever write a business plan for any of your ventures? And also, where did you get your source of funding from?
Okay, good question. I didn't write a formal business plan, and I didn't write any business plan until I got to Noah's. And then Noah's was about a 2-page concept plan with some manufactured numbers, which most business plans are anyway, based on some research I had done. And I am a firm believer of some of you who are parents who say, do as I say and not as I do. I'm a firm believer that a business plan is very important, and I've learned that, later on. If for no other reason, that it helps to clarify and organize one's thoughts about starting a business. And the more information and the more data that can be collected, the better. I did get a lot of data collected, but it was all here in this computer. Your second question had to do with funding, and all except Noah's were bootstrapped businesses. In the case of Noah's, it started out with a small loan from my 2 brothers and a small amount of money that was left by my father, and I was able to open that first store for roughly half what the later stores were opening for. Of course, we had to change out the linoleum flooring after about 3 weeks and replace it with tile because it had worn out. But that's what you do when starting a business. Eventually, however, Noah's, as it developed, went the sort of obviously more traditional financing routes, where we started out with the debt financing, and then worked into revolving lines of credit, SBA loans, and then as our need for capital increased, brought in a venture capital partner, brought in Starbucks, some outside people. So it kind of ratcheted up as the activity and the need required. Thank you.
I have 2 sets of questions. The first set involves, just one question, but I clarify it. That involves what it takes to become a full-time entrepreneur. And for me, what I hear from you is you have the fire in your belly, and then you have ants in your pants. And maybe that's what makes you a great and successful entrepreneur. I was wondering, what are the necessary conditions? And the second question is about idealism. Idealism. Is there anything that was ideal for you, like for example, that you had to compromise for business reasons? For example, you want to give the employees like free housing or something, and then you say, I can do that because I have to earn money.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. The first question is, what does it take to be an entrepreneur? And the second question is, did it come? If I'm quoting correctly, was there a time when values needed to be compromised for in the name of business success? Ideals needed to be moderated, altered in the name of business success. Okay, I think obviously, well, I like to sort of strip it down to there's two sort of major components to being an entrepreneur. And the first is to have a high tolerance for risk, that you're willing to basically jump off a diving board knowing there's about a 90% chance that there's water in it. The second one is that you'd be willing to work about twice as hard as the average employee, salaried employee in a company. And I would say that, a third component is that the business becomes something like an obsession to you. And I think that's why I focus in on the Shabbat or the Sabbath piece in my book because it kind of comes with the territory, that all-consuming passion. And unless you bridle it somehow, it can just get away from you till you're not dimensional anymore. You're tunnel visioned. And unfortunately, it does take some of that to get a business off the ground and to keep it successful. Having said that, and I've talked to other groups about this, being involved in an entrepreneurial venture is different than being the sort of, there's a Yiddish term called the Meshuggah Davar. It's like the crazy person in the middle who's like stirring it all up and makes everyone else crazy. That was kind of my role. But there's ways to be involved in entrepreneurial ventures that don't require that kind of personality. So if you're interested in getting involved in entrepreneurial ventures, it's important to partner with people that have complementary skills so that someone's a crazy guy in the middle of it, but that you be able to bring your expertise and your capabilities into the picture to create the total success, because it's obviously a package. And I talk at length in the book in one of the chapters called It Takes a Shtetl. Instead of a village, it's a shtetl. A village in Poland is where the word comes from. But truthfully, to get an enterprise off the ground, even though there's one crazy person in the middle with the idea, it takes a lot more than that to become really successful. To your second question, I would answer it as follows. And I think that in our business careers, we are involved in decisions on a day-to-day basis that test our ideals and our values. And it's very easy to slip over the line. And it's hard to sort of say, even where the line is sometimes. And it comes very fast. I was very interested in talking to someone at lunch about Google in China and about censorship, and should Google be involved in something like that. And there were policies that were made, and I remember reading the policies, and it made some internal, some sense to me. Okay, we're gonna go with the laws of the land, and within that confines, we're gonna do the most we can, and perhaps we can generate internal change. And now there's some rethinking of that subject and so forth. I think the key is to keep the moral plane in full view. Like you would get your tennis gear assembled before you go out and play tennis, I think you need your moral lens to be firmly in place when you go to the workplace, so that when these decisions come up, and some of them, as I mentioned, are very fast and very seductive, okay? And I think if the extra time that it takes to just think that through a little bit further is done, then more than likely, while greed is not going to go away and self-interest is not going to go away, slowly, incrementally, we can move towards a more ideal world.
You mentioned that you were good in picking up rising trends. What is the rising trend now?
Well, I think you're in the heart of it right here. The other trend that unfortunately I think is huge and needs to be addressed is the obesity crisis that America's in, and that we somehow, as a nation, as a society, get our arms around how to alleviate this issue. And I think that as my thesis in the book states, that there's going to be a lot of money to be made at it, as well as doing a lot of good for the planet. I think that it's very clear and obvious, and I'm restating the obvious in saying that we're on a suicide track in terms of global warming, and that if we don't get our arms around sustainable lifestyle, we're going to all fry up. And I think it's on the radar screen. I'm not sure how loud and clear it is. Anything to do with that's going to be huge, and hopefully some of those jobs will wind up in America and not overseas if we can get our entrepreneurial spirit cranked up and the wherewithal to tackle issues as vital as these two that I mentioned. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you about Noah's kosher recipes or food. I imagine that I'm guessing that 90%
Well, it's an interesting question. It's like a lot of marketing stuff, and you're going to say marketing? Wait a minute, this is kosher. But I want to give you just, and maybe others would bear with me for a second, just give a little bit of a background. I was learning with a traditional rabbi at the time when I was about to open the first store, and he wasn't going to eat in the store unless it was kosher. So I wanted it to be a place where the whole Jewish community could come, whether they ultra-Orthodox, whether they were communist, whether they were Reform, conservative, whoever they were, they could feel comfortable about going into a Noah's store. The more I looked into it, you know, it was not all that difficult because most of the products came in already kosher certified. Later on, as I was in the operation phase, I learned that it was a lot more complicated than I thought. You know, we had employees come in with ham and cheese sandwiches and toast them up in our ovens, and then what do you do? So there are a lot of nuances. But what I realized as I had initially made the decision to operate the store as kosher was that it added yet one more piece of authenticity to the enterprise that we were putting together. That if this was a genuine Lower East Side, old-timey New York bagel place, well, it should be kosher. So it was a little bit of an intangible. But I know that I got enough feedback from people that said, you know, you stand for something here. There's something that's more important than just making money and selling bagels. You have somewhat of a higher purpose that I think the kosher, while you know, represented, if you will, was symbolic of. And I know that some of our employees who were totally secular said to me that the kashrut or the kosher aspect of this business is really what bound it all together. Now, I thought it was an interesting comment, especially coming from someone that, you know, was really outside the tradition. I can remember when we closed for Passover, I had a lot of people come over to me later, non-Jews, and say how impressed they were that we had kept our values and had remained closed during the time when bread is not allowed to be consumed or sold. Many of our Jewish customers complained, "Where's our bagels?" You know, so you know you never win at all. But I think, you know, in retrospect, the only way I can answer it was that before the Sabbath, when I would walk home with a challah under each arm, you know, knowing that this was a kosher challah, just made me feel good, and I think there was a residual feeling amongst the entire workforce and our customer base that this was a company that stood for something, and in that sense, I think it was huge. So I want to thank all of you again for taking your valuable time today and coming to listen to my talk. And it was my pleasure to be here and see such an exciting company at work. Thank you very much.